What's up, future shred lords? Welcome back. Death to the Fingers. Going to be getting into some practical ideas on modal interchange. Now, listen, I know chords not exactly your guys' favorite, but this stuff is insanely important. And later on, this will become fodder for arpeggios and even scale systems if you want. So don't pass it up, because this is one of these important sort of musical concepts that can actually blow the doors wide open and give you wings to fly, because it breaks you out of this diatonic box that almost everybody tries to shove you in. So we're going to go over the basic concepts with respect to a cadence. I'm going to look at it with respect to a chord progression. And then we're going to talk about using it with respect to free play, which is obviously what you want to graduate to, where you're just using this idea in the moment. It's no longer planned out. We're going to look at the planning stages, obviously, and then how to practice it in sort of practical purposes. And then, of course, then implementing it in just a situation where you just pick up your guitar and you start improvising. Job's done. Right. Let's get into this video. All right, in that example there, you hear me basically using the concept of what I call mirror images, which means I can play several different chords that are complementary from the exact same position. Right, so I'm pairing up a bunch of C major stuff together, and then a bunch of A minor stuff together, then a bunch of F major stuff together, and then a bunch of G major stuff together, of course, and then finally ending up at C major again. I think I actually throw one of the fancy chords in there too. I think it was B flat major 7, just to change it up and show you that you can now borrow these chords to set up. That's the concept of setting up your target chord, which is going to be a lot more important in the next lesson, right? So step number 1 is this idea that you can create voice leading. If you listen to the chord movements, I start off with one chord, and then when I play the second chord, it's a slight variation, but of course there's just like one note that actually moves in that chord sequence. So it's very pleasing. And then of course, when I start to add in a few other scale notes and stuff like that, I can complete these little sort of these little melodic chunks attached to a chord, right? All these extension notes. And by doing that, I get the benefit, obviously, of hearing all the extension notes in relation to the chord I'm playing. So that's a win. But also on top of that, I have this new melodic tool that I can use to enhance the chords themselves just based on the position. And 3, it gives me a hell of a technical and sort of like dexterity workout. So, you know, I've covered all the bases. And that's just it. You have to start to think in bigger pictures, right? I do the A minor 11 as a drop chord, and then I do A minor 7. Before jumping up to like the F major kind of situation, then going into G7 before jumping up, I think it's to B flat major 7, and then finally moving into C. Notice the half step to move up to the root again. This idea of using the same concept from diminished, but now with the major 7 moving up to just a straight major triad. Notice I take the tension of the major 7 off by moving to a lower order chord, the triad, which has a much more solid bass, which basically ends my idea. So I've got all the music stuff going on there too. So you have the melody component, you have the various positions based on cage system in the open position, or moving it up as an A-type chord, an E-type chord, right, as a drop chord, right? That A minor 11 essentially is the A bass note on the E string, and then basically a C sus, I think it's C sus 4, it might be C sus 2 from the A type Now you're like, what? No, that's my point is once you get intimate with these systems, you start to understand what that actually means. And so you can take these two pieces of information and glob them together. And no longer is it a mystery what A minor 11 is. You're like, oh, just play this note and this triad. Done. Just like G9 sus4 is actually a G with an F major triad underneath it. Okay, and you're like, wow, okay, so that actually simplifies the process. It's just this bass note with this triad, and now I can just look at it that way. So anytime somebody's like, play some sort of fancy G7 chord, you can now play G9 sus4, okay, which is just going to be the G over the F chord, and Bob's your uncle. You can substitute that for one of the other chords. Now let's talk about setting up here. The setup is the idea is essentially I'm going to use the chord prior to the one I'm going to move to basically make that transition more interesting or more satisfying. Okay, so the B flat major 7 moving to the C major obviously accomplishes that goal, and the B flat major 7 part comes from the C minor scale, right? The parallel minor. I'm doing C major, and of course I borrowed that from C minor. Nails it. So that about covers this section. We're going to get into the next section here where we start to talk about the concept of 5 of 5. Again, using the setup principle, right? So now, instead of just moving through these chord shapes using the mirror images where I just use 2 A minors, but just 2 different variations, now I'm actually going to move to a completely different chord to set up the one I want to move to next. Let's do it. All right, we got the setup principle. So essentially, let's imagine we're going from this G7, okay, to say B diminished, which is going to set up the transition to really hammer home this movement to C major. Okay, so that's a basic, ultra basic version of this concept, the setup. Now imagine I want to expand that to be the 5 of 5. So I'm starting on C major. The next chord in the sequence is A minor. So I'm going to consider A minor to be A major. Think to its 5 chord, which is going to be E7. And now I'm going to insert E7 before I play the A minor. So I'm going to go from the C major to E7 to A minor. I'm going to repeat that process. The next chord in the sequence is F. F's 5 chord is C7. So now I'm going to go from A minor to C7 to F major. Next chord in the sequence, G major. Its 5 chord is D7, so I'm going to go from F major to D7 to G major, and I'm going to keep doing that process until my face falls off. Now listen, that's just 5 of 5. You could do the same thing with diminished. You can do it with other sort of like music functions. That's just one of about probably 15, of which I know about 3. So the list is endless, and it's really just limited to your imagination. So that's why this becomes very important, is this idea of setting up the chord. Now, you can do it with respect to the diatonic stuff. You can use secondary dominants like a backdoor dominant. You can use diminished theory, modal interchange. It's like, it's up to you how you want to sort of think about it. But this idea is you have this one chord and you have this other chord, and now you want to insert another chord in between there, but for all intents and purposes, you want to be like, I want to make it sound more exciting, more interesting. So I'm going to use this technique, 5 of 5. You're going to start to practice that by playing these chords in that sort of progression. Of course, you can grab any chord chart from any popular song, okay? And basically, if you know the song well enough, you can start to insert these chords before you move to the next chord in the chord chart. And that's an excellent way to actually apply this basic theory, so that you can be like, you know, When I do it like this with this dominant 7, it sounds not so great. But once I factor in diminished, sounds way better. And you just learned more in 5 minutes by doing that than you'll learn in a decade by not. And that's the whole point, is you'll start to learn about this musical gravity that happens behind the scenes between chords and scales and arpeggios, which is integral to actually growing as a musician, because you start to understand these relationships. Oh, this one's really strong. This one's very weak. You got to use this one here. You got to use this one here. Oh, you want to get to another key? Use this, this, or this. You see what I'm getting at? There's a whole bunch of tools in the toolbox, but it's up to you to basically discover how to use them. And this is one of those techniques. And of course, again, it works your mind. You have to be like, what is the 5 chord of the chord I want to go to? F. What is F's 5 chord? What is A's 5 chord? What is B's 5 chord? F sharp. What is C sharp's 5 chord? Right? And then you'll just get better and better and better at starting to, really lock in. And that's really the best thing that you can do, is try to see this as not like this insurmountable challenge, but instead like a training platform to go from being like, I don't know very much, or I can't do this very well at all, to starting to climb up the ladder to be like, all right, I can get these chord shapes down and so on and so forth, and start stringing them together. And then bada bing, bada boom, you'll start making the more complex forms, and you're off to the races, and you'll be way, way, way farther ahead of the game. Because anytime somebody does higher order music stuff, you'll recognize it instantly, at least as a borrowed chord idea. And you can be like, that was cool. And then you could go home and figure it out for yourself, just like Rick Beato does and all the rest of it. The reason he can do that is because he actually understands what it is that he's hearing, so he can start to decipher it, because he has a rough idea. For the rest of us mortals, we kind of got to sit there for a little bit and let it stew in the melon, but very important step. So there's another way of using the setup, if you will, to get even more mileage, to create a chord progression, now the 5-1, to, again, create this much stronger resolution. And again, you see me using voice leading and trying to create melodies and be musical. It's not about speed or doing 6 trillion chords. It's about trying to string together a series of chords where it sounds nice. You could be sitting in a church just playing and people be like, that's beautiful. You know what I mean? And that's really the entire goal. It's not about shred anymore. It's about slow, methodical thought process to be like, what's the next chord that's going to sound the best in that sequence? And then using your available knowledge, selecting it, choosing the proper inversion, and then playing it on the guitar in split second. Good luck. Let's get into the free play section. All right, there's me doing the free play, essentially using this technique, if you will. That's a really important stage. You're always working towards this idea of doing the free play, right? All roads lead to Rome. You're doing it with scales, you're doing it with arpeggios, and now you're doing it with chords. This builds the creative mind. It gives you the tools necessary to be able to think quickly in the moment and not be like a deer in the headlights and just get the job done. It's like you can go and sit down in front of a group of people and just instantly come up with something amazing, and they'd be like, damn, kid can play, right? So that's kind of the goal. And of course, there's these ancillary benefits where you're learning something new. You're starting to break out of the box. You're being forced to consider the chord aspects, the scale aspects, the arpeggio aspects, it impacts and options, which the constant reinforcement of that just starts to reinforce those connections. So you get faster at being like, oh, do this or do that or go here, and which gives you the speed of mind, which translates to speed of fingers. Right? You can't play fast until you can think on your feet fast. You could play the arpeggio quickly, but the second you're required to actually string it together in some sort of musical context without actually having the training wheels on, well, you're up the creek, right? So that's why it's important to train the creative mind. And there's the other advantages too with respect to, again, the ear training, hearing these cadences, hearing the setup chords, hearing the diminished resolution, the dominant 7 resolution, hearing the sort of imperfect resolutions and perfect resolutions like perfect and plagal cadences. All of that stuff done over the span of years turns you into an amazing musician. But most people don't even practice it because they're like, well, yeah, okay. That's one of those dusty old man music concepts I don't need to know. No, it's not. It's really important stuff. And later on, it becomes really important because you need those chords, obviously. And that's what you see. Go listen to something like Somewhere Over the Rainbow. There's like 600 chords in that song. Right? And people are like, often they're like, how did they do that? Well, this is how they did it. Imagine one of these little sort of snippets, instead of playing C 4 times, that I have 4 different chords there now for just that one bar, moving from C to the next C, right? So I'm doing a series of diminished inversions, or I'm doing a 2-5-1, right? So you go from the C to the C's 2 chord, which would be D minor, to the 5 chord, which would be G7, back to the 1 chord, right? So then you could do a substitute where you substitute out one beat of the G7 to set up the C again, maybe B diminished. So I think you're starting to get the idea. I can start chaining endlessly these chords together and keep bisecting it into smaller and smaller slivers, adding more and more chords to create a more complex chord sequence. Now, listen, you wouldn't normally do that in a practical application, but still, the fact that you could and that you should be doing that in the free play stuff is absolutely essential, because you'll start to really dig in and find these juicy combinations. You'd be like, oh, that one's mine. That'll become part of your signature sound. So don't sleep on this one. Incredibly important. And remember, start with a couple simple systems like C major and C minor, or G major, G minor. Write them out. Look at the scales or the chord sort of similarities, find the ones that aren't similar, and then start to factor them in either as major 7s, dominant 7s, or minors, depending on the context, right? You have to look at it in terms of the context of the scale that you drew it from. So obviously, if it's the 5th degree, it can be a dominant 7 chord. If it's the 4th degree, it can be a major 7. It's the 1st degree, it can be major 7. If it's the 6th degree, it's a minor or minor 7. So don't forget that. Very important. And then, of course, start to insert them into these chord progressions. Do a 1-4-5, where you start to do the 5 of the 4 chord you're going to go to, and then do the 5 of 5, and then do the 5 to go back to the 1, right? And all of a sudden, you'll have this thing, and then you'll be like, oh, look, well, if I can do that, I can now insert a 2-5-1 before each of them. So instead of doing 5 of 5, I'm now going to go from the 1 chord to the 5 chord, but now add in the 2 and the 1 chord from that same scale system before moving to the next chord. So I've now compartmentalized the movement down to 3 chords. I went from just 1 chord to another chord to the target chord. Now I've replaced just that 1 chord with 3 chords, the 2-5-1, or I could do a 1-4-5. I think you can see how this starts to get insane. And you can keep doing those little substitutions to turn 5 chords into 40 chords. And of course, free play, you're meant to be doing this in the moment, out of the ether, directly from the mind. Keep practicing that skill until you can. Don't cheat. I appreciate every single one of you. I think that's the end of this video. And of course, just take it slow. Don't get too hyped up about it. Start slowly with just 2 chords. and then start to build up, and then start working outwards from there using more exotic chord sequences. It's up to you to set your own training regime. If you go way off into the deep end, you're going to assure failure. Instead, dial it back, use some simple concepts, work it out on your own sort of like, in your own understanding, and then basically, boom, start using it as much as possible, and then start applying that concept everywhere. Oh, you can do it with chords? I guess I can do it with scales. How does it work with scales? Oh, I can do it with arpeggios. How would that work with arpeggios? There you go. There's 2 months worth of work right there. Done. See you in the next one.